I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. The Maryland General Assembly, a bicameral body with a House of Delegates and a Senate, finished its annual 90-day spring session this week, passing 800 bills out of nearly 3,000 which were filed. That's par for the course most years. The big difference this year is that it seems like a normal legislative year after several sessions of extraneous influences. So normal that even a big tragedy like the collapse of the Key Bridge does not seem to have disturbed the normality of legislative work. Both chambers of the Assembly and the Governor's House are in Democratic hands, and the action, if you will, was within the party. To wrap up the 2024 Assembly session, I invited Maryland Matters editor and 30-year veteran of Annapolis coverage, Josh Kurtz. And joining us for the first time is Pamela Wood of the Baltimore Banner and formerly of the Baltimore Sun, who is closing in on a decade of Annapolis reporting. Music for this episode comes from Damascus, Maryland-based rapper and music producer Cataclysm. Songs used in this episode come from his album Machine Gun Preacher. You can find his music on YouTube at The Reckoning 301.
When that ransom look too handsome, we can't stand, son. Come walk with bosses in the peaceful backyard garden. Just had to talk with Harden, and the money be the problem. Surrounded by the goblins, the vultures, the rats, impacted by the culture. I perform with my back to my enemies, and I fricassee their carcass. I pass the bone to matches and dispatch some gas to start.
Josh Kurtz, welcome back. And Pam Wood, a very special first-time welcome to I Hate Politics.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for inviting us.
What were your takeaways from the 2024 Maryland General Assembly session? All right, who wants to go first?
I think when we're talking about this session, it's kind of important to say, in a way, what didn't happen, because in certain ways, this was the first quote unquote normal session in a while. In 2019, during the session, the Senate President, Mike Miller, was very ill for a good chunk of the time, and the House Speaker, Mike Bush, died on the next to last day of session. 2020, we had new presiding officers, and then there was COVID. 2021 was a totally surreal session with strange COVID protocols. 2022, there were still some COVID protocols, and there were fights over redistricting, and it was an election year. Last year, there were a bunch of newbies and a new governor. And so this is really like the first time where it felt like they could devote themselves to legislating without 1,000 different distractions. And so there were a huge number of bills. There was a lot of legislative churn. A bunch of things got passed. But I've been struggling to find kind of a theme for what happened, and it almost felt like things were rudderless for part of the time.
Yeah, it's hard. I too, since Sine Die a couple days ago, have been grasping for what's like the theme, or what's overarching. What did we learn in this session? And part of it is like Democratic majority is going to be Democratic majority, and there wasn't a gigantic problem to solve this year. There was some fights over the budget, but the budget wasn't quite in crisis mode yet. They tried to save the horse racing industry again, which I paid a lot of attention to, but it just wasn't that dramatic in the end. There wasn't a ton of attention. But then we had, the Key Bridge collapsed right near the end of session, which is just traumatic and terrible for people in Baltimore. But really, the gears of government, responded to that the way they do the state government, the federal government, and there's actually not that much lawmakers could do. They did what they could. They passed an aid package, but it didn't really disrupt the legislature that much in the end.
I thought that the bridge collapse had some effect on the budget negotiations, and that it hastened them and made them go faster, because I had interviewed David Moon just prior to the bridge collapse. And in fact, the episode came out on the day of. David Moon was talking about calling out his Democratic partners to be more receptive to the House's proposals. And then suddenly the next weekend we got the budget deal.
I think that was probably going to happen anyway, because there's a timeline for them to propose a budget, and nobody really wanted to go into overtime on that. I think the governor, he issued a proclamation creating the possibility of an extended session a few days after the bridge collapse. And he kind of said, well, under these circumstances, I'm expecting the legislature to pass a responsible budget very soon. But I mean, I think it was probably going to happen anyway. Whether it impacted the contours of the deal itself, it's kind of hard to say. But I mean, the legislature kind of operates in its own bubble most of the time, and even something as catastrophic as a bridge collapse will only change things so much.
People invoked the bridge and, brought it up in terms of like, see, this is why we have to raise some more money, because we have to, fund transportation. But I don't think that really moved the needle at all on how people perceived the budget. And what they were disagreeing on was how much more money needed to be raised specifically for education and transportation. And, the House and the Senate, this was a fight among Democrats. It was like an in-party fight. And they met somewhere in the middle. And I think that's kind of all was inevitable. I don't think the bridge affected it.
The House and Senate really did stake out different positions. And it was kind of interesting to see how it all went down and how they were dug in for a while. And as Pam said, it was really a genuine compromise. But until that happened, it was interesting to see how different the two sides were in a certain way.
Let's answer that question. I mean, why is it that the Senate and the House took those really different positions?
The House leadership just they came with a more aggressive approach to raising revenue, and how much of it did they really want or expect to get this year, and how much of it was just kind of putting this on the table to like speed it along, set the table for next year's discussions of the budget. And the two things that the House really wanted that didn't happen in the end was full legalization of online gambling, playing poker on your phone and what have you. And the other one was a corporate tax reform. But the Senate, meanwhile, said, look, we've got enough money. We can just move things around a little bit and just do a couple small things and we're fine. And, save that discussion for another day. They just took two different views of sort of the urgency of raising more money.
And one of the interesting things, I mean, tying this back to the bridge, is that certainly Senate President Bill Ferguson and to an extent Governor Moore both said, we don't need to raise revenues now because we expect the economy to grow in a robust way. And, one thing the bridge collapse has kind of suggested is that, well, maybe the economy isn't going to grow because now we kind of have to focus on the recovery. And so I would argue that now that the bridge has collapsed and there's a lot more uncertainty in the state economy, that it's more likely that they will next year, whether they want it or not.
There's three major parties at play here in the budget discussion: the House, the Senate, and the governor. The Senate and the governor were of the mind of, we don't need significant tax increases. And then the House was over here saying, no, we need to start raising money now. We're not going to believe in that bet on the economy. Let's make this a sure thing. Well, 2 out of 3 put the House in a difficult negotiating position.
So even before the bridge collapse, the comptroller Brooke Learmon's State of the Economy report clearly suggested that there was, economic headwinds ahead. So what is the basis from which the governor and the Senate president were talking?
I mean, there might have been an element of wishful thinking in there. I don't know. And certainly on the governor's part, a reluctance to talk about tax increases. I mean, he said, even well before the session that he'd have a high bar for raising taxes. He said that throughout the session. He's, said it since the session, in the couple of days since the session. And so, I mean, I think one of the things this governor is well aware of is how popular his predecessor became by, railing against tax increases, avoiding tax increases in almost all cases. And, there's a lesson he's learned there, and and a playbook he may be following to a degree.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say what's interesting too about nobody wants their taxes raised. Nobody wants to be the one who says like, yeah, hi, it was me. I raised your taxes. But conventional political thinking is that if you're gonna raise taxes in your 4-year term, you do it in year 1 or year 2, and we're in year 2. That year 4 never. That's your election year, and year 3 is still too close to the election that people will remember. Oh, hey, last year that guy or those folks raised my taxes. So that's somewhat of an argument for if you're going to do it this year. But I think Josh is right. There's some wishful thinking. It's a long-term play to try and say we need more economic activity, and more economic activity will bring in more taxes. That's a long-term play that they hope is going to pay off. But yeah, we'll see.
Now, the bridge collapse itself, money for that has come, all of it has come from the rainy day fund, or is it also from the regular budget?
Well, for rebuilding, for the clearing operation, any dredging at the channel, the rebuilding it, that is expected to come from the feds. And President Biden said, we'll move heaven and earth, we'll do it all. Now you got to get Congress to act, and good grief, you can't rely on Congress, but the delegation from Maryland is definitely making a push for that to come true. Separately, lawmakers in Annapolis did pass something called the Port Act, which is a variety of financial aid for some workers, small businesses, scholarships for the families of the 6 road workers who died when the bridge fell. That is all going to come out of the rainy day fund, but there's a provision if there are insurance settlements, if there's federal aid, if there's other ways of making that money, then that would be used. And there is language in there to ensure no double dipping as well. So they'll come out of the rainy day fund. I mean, it remains to be seen how much actually will get used.
So we'll put this down to a success. Are there any other successes that you thought were important?
One that I've been following, I mentioned, was the thoroughbred horse racing industry, which,
yes.
I leave it to people to decide for themselves if it was a success or not. It was a success in that it was a bill passed and a plan going forward. Long story short, the private company that owns Pimlico Racecourse up here in Baltimore, the Stronach Group, is going to give Pimlico to the state. I believe it's technically for $1, but that's basically free. The state's going to take it over and issue bonds and spend hundreds of millions of dollars renovating that track, opening a new horse training center at a to-be-determined location. And the state's going to take over running races. They're going to set up a nonprofit entity that's actually going to do the day-to-day, but that's going to be under the auspices of the state government owning this track. And I mean, look, the state owns a football stadium, the state owns a baseball stadium. Now the state's going to own a racetrack, which is a little bit wild. And it's a big bet. It's a big bet, but the people behind this say, hey, we're betting on ourselves that we can do it better in Maryland. So I'm going to be watching that in the next few years to see how if that plays out and goes to plan, which previous racing plans have not gone to plan.
What happened to the housing bills?
I think neither one of us is the expert in our shops on housing.
I mean, the short answer is they passed. I don't think the governor got everything he wanted in there, but I mean, sort of the top line story is there's, it'll make it easier to finance certain affordable housing deals now as a result of these bills. I think it provides some zoning flexibility to build more affordable housing, though local governments resisted some of that. It does set up a kind of an office of I don't know what the formal name is, but there's going to be a tenant protection office set up in the state housing and community development department. But there were some things that were stripped out, and tenant advocates I know are still not happy because there's some other bills they wanted that didn't get passed.
Yeah, and the one bill about more affordable housing and the flexibility. My understanding was it was allowing more density, more units to be built, but under conditions including proximity to a transit stop, or former state-owned property, or it's being run by a nonprofit, and if a certain number are affordable, defined as affordable units, you could build more of them. But transit was one of those criteria to get that extra density, which, it sort of overrides local zoning a little bit there, which is interesting.
The law that finally passed actually lowered the number for affordability number that the governor had proposed, but it took away reopening the part, single family zoned areas to higher density, even if they were near, transit stations. So in fact, they limited very much. In fact, I would say diluted fully the intent of the bill to actually have an impact, because now you can only build more density in places where you can already build more density.
As often happens in Annapolis.
Yeah. There was definitely some local government freak out over those bills.
What seemed to me also unusual is that the vote actually masks the opposition to the bill. Because the vote is almost all party line, and it shows considerable support, but underneath, if you talk to people, there is considerable opposition.
Yeah, there isn't really a rich tradition of sort of activist, robust housing legislation in Maryland that I can think of, and the governor has touted it as kind of the most meaningful housing legislation to pass in forever. And, he's probably, whether it's been diluted or not, he's probably right, just because it's never been done before.
What else is there? Did you mark any other successes?
What's interesting to me is you can look at any number of subjects and you can see successes. If you're into public health, they passed a higher tobacco tax, and that's meaningful. If you're into climate and the environment, they did some good things on waterways and forest lands and some environmental justice stuff. But if you kind of think of like what they could have done in each of these areas, it was kind of mild mannered. Certainly, I think environmental groups took a bunch of hits, and and I think you could probably go through a bunch of issues and see the same.
So, if these are the successes, are there any particular failures you're thinking about that, something that did not get done?
Yeah, I think one that didn't pass in the end, if we're talking about gun control, is there was a proposal to put an extra tax on purchasing of guns, ammunition, and accessories. And that money was supposed to go to fund the state's trauma system, which is not just shock trauma up here in Baltimore, but the other trauma hospitals, the transport system, and everything. That had a lot of momentum. The idea being that people get shot, whether, on purpose, on accident, suicide attempt, and they end up in these trauma centers that we have in Maryland. So there's a nexus there between the behavior of buying a gun and the need to fund the trauma system. But that sort of fell apart in the last couple of days. I know there were some legal questions, but I haven't quite yet unraveled exactly why that didn't happen. So that's sort of an interesting one to play out and see if it's going to come back next year.
What about that bill that Senator Wallstreicher had about immunity? That went through, right?
Yeah, I believe that one did pass, and that allows the state attorney general or the county attorneys, or here in Baltimore, we have a city solicitor, to sue the gun industry, manufacturers and such, for, the damage our products have done. I don't exactly know the mechanism of how it would work or how interested Attorney General Anthony Brown or any of the county attorneys are, like how quickly they might try and use this. I certainly expect that this will get challenged in court. Any major gun legislation in Maryland gets challenged in court, so it could be some time before that all sort of plays out to see if the law can actually be executed.
I think what the bill did was to strip away private right of action.
Yeah, and I think the Attorney General did write, or his office did write a letter saying we think this is constitutional, but it didn't strike me as being kind of a full-throated endorsement either.
So any other failures?
Just before the session began, the state environment department put out a study saying, okay, Maryland has all these climate goals. It's going to take us $1 billion a year for 10 years to meet these climate goals. And the governor this year made $90 million available. That ain't $1 billion, and some of that money kind of was already sitting in a pot somewhere. So it isn't even new money. And I think there were several measures, some quite broad, a few others less so, that would have brought some more money in for climate. And they didn't really go anywhere, and there just doesn't seem to be the political will or leadership yet to, really address the aggressive goals in a meaningful way. So, I would certainly call that a failure.
Another bill that failed, which some see as actually a success that it failed, and some see it as a failure that it failed, which is the medical aid in dying, which has been around Annapolis for a long time. What it is basically a patient who is terminally ill and meets certain criteria could get a prescription from a doctor for medication they could administer themselves to, initiate their own death. And it's been around a bunch of times. It's had a lot of dramatic past. We were told this year, last year, we were told by leadership it's not happening. This year, Senate President Ferguson told us, okay, yeah, we're going to take a vote on it this year. But it never did because the votes weren't there. The House, it's believed, has the votes to pass this bill. It's always been tougher in the Senate. The votes aren't there.
My guess is if that bill came to a vote on the Senate floor, it would probably pass narrowly. But the problem was in the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee, where they just didn't have the votes. And so, sometimes what happens with some of these more controversial pieces of legislature is, if the leadership is serious about moving it, you gotta either change the membership of the committee or change the jurisdiction, change the committee of jurisdiction. This was the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee. Maybe you figure out a way to send it to the Finance Committee, which does healthcare stuff instead. There are different ways to skin a cat, but I'm not even sure if the political will is there. And as Pam said, it could just languish for another couple of years until the next election.
There was an incredible bill that talked about the involuntary commitment of mental health patients that then got stripped off its most consequential parts, which is that there would be repercussions for those that did not follow through, mental health patients that did not, go through whatever treatment was prescribed.
That was one of those bills that seemed like there was a lot of blowback once it started moving. It was kind of, it didn't get that much attention until toward the end. It did come from the administration. I wonder if that gets signed. I don't know.
The other one that I thought was pretty eye-popping was the juvenile justice bill. They just raised the age of, nonviolent offenses from 10 to 13. And now 2 years later, they brought it back down to 10.
It's not for all charges, but it's for gun-related charges and I believe auto theft, which are two areas of concern. But yeah, it was only 2 years ago that basically you couldn't get arrested younger than 13 unless you were doing the most, unless you're doing a very violent act. And yeah, just 2 years later. And one of the concerns that was raised was just lack of data. When you enact a reform and only 2 years later start to roll it back, do you have enough data to show that this is needed and that it's going to achieve whatever your policy objective is? that was a big concern that was raised, that it was just so quick after the prior legislation.
Is then the concern about public safety so large that they just went like, no, we'll reverse?
There's a big perception of juvenile crime being out of control. The data doesn't really bear it out. There are some specific things, like here in Baltimore and elsewhere in the state, there is a rash of car thefts and carjackings, this Kia Hyundai thing, which, maybe that's a blip that goes away on its own eventually, hard to say. But there is a big perception of juvenile crime, and a lot of it is media driven, to be clear. And lawmakers really felt like they had to do something because they were being hounded by some reporters of, aren't you going to do something? Are you going to have an emergency session of the legislature to address this? They were getting a lot of pressure from the media and then from their constituents. And I think that's part of what drove, this bill, which had some other elements as well, but that was one of the key ones.
We can't overemphasize the influence of the media on this particular legislation. And, one TV station in Baltimore in particular has kind of made this its crusade, and it's carried that crusade into the city elections in Baltimore, which are taking place this spring. And and they literally had reporters just like or a reporter just following the governor, following the presiding officers, sticking a mic in their faces, or at press conferences, and just drumming that issue home. It was very noteworthy.
One media outlet can do that. What does that say about coverage of the legislature then?
Well, I mean, look, if you look at Maryland Matters and the Baltimore Banner, and a lot of us who do this year round and are there every day, we value like thoughtful, nuanced coverage, and Maryland Matters does it very well. On the juvenile issue, my colleague Brenda Wintrode really did a lot of deep dives on this, but we only have so much audience and so much perspective, and drama sells.
I mean, I think if you're a print reporter, you're used to the broadcast media parachuting in and blowing up an issue or emphasizing something that isn't happening to our eyes. But this seemed particularly extreme, I would say, more so than other years.
What are the legislators going to do over the summer for next year? Apart from climate, is there anything else that they are looking at? I would imagine the Transportation Trust Fund is a big thing to resolve.
Yeah, I think this year was probably a warm up for what we'll see over the summer and next year about the budget, how to fund the education blueprint for Maryland's future, how to fund the transportation needs. There's a group called the Train Commission that's been meeting to study transportation financing. At one point, it was going to get eliminated in these budget debates, but no, it lives to see another day, another year. So I think we're going to have a warm up and more discussions on that front.
I think it's mostly going to be, either directly or with a subtext. It's all going to be about money. That's what folks are going to obsess about this summer, probably.
Wow. Enjoy the baseball. Thank you both. I'm Wood, Josh Kurtz.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was fun.
Thank you.
Wake your sleeping ass, the day is coming in an instant. Prefer to be consistent with visions that I did begin with. Don't change for Nathan, I'm with Satan in the dormitory.
That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. Don't forget to tune in to our Tuesday morning news analysis next week. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, and assistant producers Daniel Galileo, Katarina Gasek, and Catherine Amaya Escobar, with support from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the University's Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from Damascus, Maryland-based rapper and music producer Cataclysm. Songs used in this episode come from his album Machine Gun Preacher. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
Put that on as glad as the glass half full, they cannot stand it. I'd rather take my chances with a smile than some grizzly mugging. My cousin got me hip to that, he might be filled with something. A funny substance called patience, love, and the wisdom will have you on the mission for religion, but don't make you that decision.